So let's talk the SHANNARA Chronicles. We're going to be reviewing episodes 1 and 2, which is a new fantasy TV show that's debuted on MTV. Now, this has been compared to Game of Thrones in other review sites. I, however, disagree. Other than the fact they're kind of fantasy shows, it's pretty much like saying, oh yeah, Star Wars, that's like Aliens. It really isn't the same thing. It doesn't have the same tone, doesn't have the same themes. I'll come on to it again in a minute. Though it does have some similarities to other kind of fantasy elements, as I'll kind of run through. So we'll go for the basic premise. It won't go too much into spoilers, but other than giving you the basic setup for this kind of TV show. So we'll be talking about specifically the first 2 episodes. So the setup here is this is actually based on Earth, but it's far in the future, and the kind of human life as we know it is ended. There are still humans on the planet, but ultimately there's been some kind of catastrophe. And, you know, that basically evolution has kind of made all these kind of like subspecies of humans, one of which being elves. And we're at a place where there's peace on this kind of this sort of landscape. However, at some point in the past, there was this kind of demonic war, and obviously the demons lost. They were kind of trapped away, and then for a while there's been peace. But now it seems the demons are kind of trying to rise again, and they've all been kind of forgotten about. And some people say, oh yeah, we don't really believe that's just all kind of folklore. Although they do sort of say that this could have happened 30 odd years ago. So I don't know, 30 odd years really isn't that far. Especially if we're taking it in the context, this is basically based in, still our times, if you know what I mean, our kind of like yearly cycle and stuff like that. So that's my first little nitpick with this. Anyway, and it focuses on a group of characters that I'm assuming will all come together at some point, and we basically have a kind of this kind of elven princess, this kind of half elf guy who's basically of heroic lineage, shall we say. We have a human kind of mage, I want to call him, played by Manu, Bennett, who is basically you may know him from Deathstroke on Arrow. He's in Spartacus. He was Crixus in Spartacus, and some kind of like female rogue as well. These are basically going to be our heroes, and they're going to kind of band together and kind of defeat this kind of evil underworld that's kind of rising up. And basically, there's this kind of large, kind of like mystical tree the elves are essentially protecting, and every time it kind of sheds a leaf, a demon will rise, and this kind of tree is on its way out. So that's kind of all I'll say in regards to the plot. Let's talk about the specifics about what kind of worked and what didn't work for me. This is a lavish production. We'll talk about the positives first. This looks really nice. They've obviously spent a bit of money on this. Obviously, I think Game of Thrones is clearly the biggest kind of TV show that we have at the moment. And even though I feel this is very different from Game of Thrones, they are clearly trying to take a slice of that pie. So they spent some money on kind of the look of this film, this TV show. So I feel some of the kind of I especially like the kind of the costuming, the kind of for example, you'll see a lot of these kind of elf kind of guards and stuff, and they have like cool looking armour, and they're really only in the background. They don't really have a lot of kind of screen time, but with the attention to detail purely on these kind of sort of background characters is fantastic. Even when we do see the kind of the costuming, they have these kind of little ear jewellery and stuff like that. I thought it was really good. I kind of really like this kind of the level of kind of detail and thing they've gone for this kind of like the look of this sort of show. I think the characters all seem kind of quite kind of heroic archetypes that you can kind of get behind. You've got Manu Bennett, who is this kind of this stoic druid, basically, or mage, or wizard, or kind of however you want to kind of look at him, basically. But he's a bit of we know he's a bit of a badass. If you've obviously seen any of those previous shows I've mentioned. You've got Wil here, who is the kind of the half-elf played by Austin Butler. And he's probably going to be, this is the kind of the SHANNARA in the title here. He's the lineage of SHANNARA, so I'm guessing he's pretty much going to be your kind of main character here. And he's a bit of a kind of a clumsy oaf, but he's kind of likeable at the same time, I have to say. And then we have the kind of the elven princess, who is somewhat of a feminist spin, I have to say. The very first kind of shot of this is like, oh, I'm a woman in a man's world, and blah blah blah, and men are holding me down, all that kind of stuff. And then we have this kind of like female rogue who doesn't really have a lot to do with these kind of first couple of episodes. You know, so I guess we're going to have these heroes very much set off in a Dungeons and Dragons style kind of quest. And this is where I feel the main influence of this is this kind of Dungeons and Dragons, which was obviously born of kind of Lord of the Rings, really. And you know, in the typical kind of Dungeons and Dragons fare, you have a group of heroes, you know, a mixed bag of people kind of drawn together and go off on a quest. And this is that. This is where the influence lies for this, not so much Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is very much about the kind of the relationships and the political intrigue based on a very kind of loose, fantastic sort of setting. I mean, the fantasy elements of Game of Thrones were never massive to begin with. They're kind of getting a bit more now, but this is really at the forefront of this kind of TV show. So I kind of quite like the characters. Some of the things I didn't like about this kind of first colour pilot, it suffers from your typical kind of teen pilot. All, you know, when we first see this kind of elven competition, which is the first thing in the kind of TV show, it looks like an Abercrombie and Finch basically advert, because you've got all these kind of like, you know, all the kind of guys look like they should be kind of working in an Abercrombie and Finch store and stuff like that. No one is ever kind of a little bit kind of grimy or gritty. It's a very kind of made for glossy TV show, if you know what I mean. So whilst if you do compare Game of Thrones to this, that has a level of kind of gritty and griminess that this one doesn't have. This one is very much like a polished TV production, so don't be expecting the kind of the level of, I would say, sophistication maybe that the Game of Thrones has. I do feel it kind of maybe goes to some little, you know, typical TV cliches here. Like I've mentioned before, these guys, oh, we don't believe these legends of these demons, even though apparently it only happened 30 years previous and stuff like that. I mean, it just doesn't seem plausible to me and things like that. And there are some kind of typical kind of dumb decisions that people make in typical TV fashion to kind of move the plot along. I mentioned influences. To me, like I say, the real influence is Dungeons and Dragons, and if you're looking for a kind of visual cue here, if you've ever seen the Dungeons and Dragons sequel TV movies, not the original, forget about the original Dungeons and Dragons movie, but the second two Dungeons and Dragons films, it really does remind me of that, to be quite honest. I'd also say there is elements of Ralph Spassky's Wizards, because that had the kind of it's a fantasy landscape, but it was based on Earth, but in the future. I would say the look of it also kind of reminds me of Kroll, kind of an 80s kind of fantasy movie, and also the more recent Legend of the Seeker show, which I feel, if you want to compare it to a TV show, it's more like that compared to, say, Game of Thrones. Now, I don't have a lot wrong with it, to be honest with you. I thought it was quite an enjoyable TV show, other than being somewhat kind of typical in some of the stuff that it basically does, and having the incredibly attractive cast and all of that. I enjoyed it. I would recommend checking out if you are a fan of kind of fantasy. It looks like it will be fun, maybe not the deepest kind of show ever. Like I said, I haven't read the books. I'm not sure the story, where the story goes and how deep it does get. I'm only basing this on the first couple of episodes, but I'll give it a 7.5 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.